This is not Yemen, exploring Hana al-Yaman by Awa. Let's give you a little bit background on Awa, the band. It's an Israeli international band made up of three sisters, Ta'ir, Liron and Tagel Chaim. They were raised in the remote desert village of Shaharut, which is about 1 hour's drive north of Eilat. You can probably see that they're not making it up when they say remote. If you look up at the top of the map, you'll see Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and all the way down at the bottom, you'll see the location finder seemingly pointing at Yotvata, but it's actually pointing at Shaharut, which is a long way from Yotvata, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Their grandparents emigrated to Israel from Yemen in 1949 in Operation Magic Carpet. They studied music and arts as kids, would always sing together, and their first hit, Habib Galbi, in 2015, really exploded onto the global market with their close harmonies, the dance beat and desert stylings, conquering the world pretty much. Even Al Jazeera featured them. Their music was celebrated. And this song, Hana al-Yaman, This Is Not Yemen, is sung in a rare Arabic Jewish Yemenite dialect. I mean, you might imagine it as a kind of Yiddish or a kind of Ladino, but less well known. And it tells the story of their grandmother. In fact, the entire album from which this song is drawn explores the story of their grandmother, her journey from Yemen to Israel's transit camps of the 1950s, the Ma'abarot. And we should dig into these Ma'abarot a little bit further before we go listen to the song. The transit camps of 1948 to 1952, they were a temporary housing solution to accommodate Israel's surge of immigrants following World War II. So there were like over 300,000 immigrants arriving in this fledgling state which just didn't have enough homes to put them in. And so they lived in tents and tin huts in what ended up being a particularly controversial initiative, in particular because 80% of those who ended up in these Ma'abarot were Jewish immigrants from Arab and North African lands, what we now know as Mizrahim, and very few Ashkenazim immigrants from Europe. They were living in conditions pretty much comparable to refugee camps. Crime was high, work was nowhere to be found, sanitation was poor, and it set up a deep-seated resentment among the children of people who were in the camps, who grew up in the camps, their families in the camps, a deep-seated resentment towards the Ashkenazi establishment for putting these folks in what they saw as a humiliating situation where around 80% of the kids didn't even receive an education. And so memories of humiliation and discrimination continue to echo within the Ashkenazi Mizrahi discourse in Israel, and this song speaks to that resentment of being put in these Ma'abarot, which are supposed to be home. I now recommend that you go listen to the song. Up in the top right, you can click on the link to the YouTube video. You'll see the official video and you'll be able to follow the English subtitles. The link is also down in the comments below. Meet you in a minute. So here we have a poster from the early days of the state, a poster from the JNF, the Jewish National Fund, Keren Kayemet L'Yisrael, and it's quoting down at the bottom a direct quotation from Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 8, naming what we know as the 7 species, the crops that we specifically make sure to eat on Tu B'Shvat, on Shavuot, on Sukkot, a land of wheat and barley and vines and fig and pomegranate, a land of olive oil and honey. Now, first of all, what's interesting in the song is that these very same words are sung. But first of all, they're sung not in the classical Hebrew, but in the Yemeni Arabic dialect, which maybe reminds us that while much of Jewish tradition has seen itself as connected to communities in Europe, the land upon which our Bible is located is very much an Arab land, an Arabic land with local flora, and these wheat and dates and figs and olive oils and pomegranates, they don't come from Europe. They grow in Arab lands, perhaps in Yemen as well as in the new state of Israel. But also we have this really interesting shift in that the sisters use the word home instead of honey. So there's a list of what makes one feel at home, which may well perhaps be lacking in the land of milk and honey. Where will I stake my home? Well, the traditional call and reply of this song allows for this. It's a kind of a theatrical chorus whereby the main character speaks and is replied to by the chorus. And they're always calling her situation into question. She talks about staking her home, and they say, well, listen, you've got a tent for now. You know, it's not actually a home. It's not actually a house. And then she aspires to move from a tent to a small shack. Like you can see in the image, there was a kind of a progression from tents to shacks. And the chorus again reminds her with this ironic flick that even if you get a shack, you're going to have to share it with several other families. The poor and cramped housing of these camps were notorious, or at least emerged as such in hindsight, or when talked about, not by the Ashkenazi establishment, but when talked about by Mizrahim who actually experienced life in these camps. Don't let them take your daughter. So now we've got the world-weary modern feminist voice of the chorus hinting quite threateningly and quite painfully at one of the greatest scandals to animate the Israeli Yemenite community in Israel. Israel, ever since the 50s, has been awash with talk of kidnapped Yemeni children from the time of the Ma'abarot. Hundreds of Yemenite parents of this time tell of their kids getting sick and being taken off to hospital and never returning. And if they received word at all, their parents were told that their children had died, but were never shown where the kids were buried, were never shown death certificates, or even had the bodies returned to them. The children had just disappeared, and from this emerged rumours, theories, testimonies of Yemeni children being effectively stolen by the state and given to families to adopt, families who had lost their own children during the Holocaust. Since the 1960s, there have been 4 separate government inquiries into these accusations, and all 4 have rejected the parents' version of events, and all 4 have been seen as a whitewash, which may explain why there have been so many recurring inquiries. In 2021, government compensation has been given to these families, but only for the pain and stress caused by not informing them properly of their children's death or burial site. But the Yemenite community see that this is wholly insufficient because it's not an apology for the crime of organised kidnapping. And more, a younger generation is demanding answers about the Yemeni children. You saw me as primitive, sings their grandmother. And indeed, unfortunately, the Israeli establishment at the time of the Ma'abarot did see Mizrahim as primitive. And racist utterances did emerge from government and from the media. Arie Galblum wrote in then prestigious newspaper Haaretz in 1949, quote, "A race like this has not been known in Israel. They are most primitive people. Their level of education borders on complete ignorance, and worse than that, they are entirely lacking in the ability to absorb anything spiritual. In general, they are not much better than the Arabs among whom they lived." End quote. To say that you saw me as primitive is actually a euphemism. And finally, we should just take a look at this video clip. There is something fantastic, I think, about the energy and the rebellion and the provocation about the video clip. Because while the character in the song seems to feel somewhat powerless or at least overpowered, the visuals of the video, they talk of a clear feminist Mizrahi strength and force. And the traditional pots on the sisters' heads come across as more than cooking implements of the poor, but rather a kind of a fashion statement, saying, you know what, let's stick it right in your face. And altogether, dance and the defiance of the video seem to condemn the treatment of their grandmother, whilst at the same time celebrating their own independence and power, now richly earned, as they perform across the world. This is Not Yemen, brought to you in partnership with Moishe House, generously funded by the Jim Joseph Foundation, and created by Makom, the Israel Education Lab of the Jewish Agency. Thank you.